Margaret and Roger Turner seemed like the perfect couple, until Margaret's sudden death unleashed a shocking secret. Roger stood to gain $1,700,000, 0 cents, and behind closed doors, a deadly plan was already in motion. On a chilly March morning in Ashfield, Illinois, a 911 call came from a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Paramedics arrived at the home of Margaret and Roger Turner just before 7:00 a.m. Margaret, 67 years old, was found slumped in a chair in the sunroom, a half-elf cup of tea still warm on the table beside her. Roger, her husband of over 30 years, claimed he had woken up and found her like that, unresponsive and not breathing. The paramedics tried to revive her, but she was declared dead at the scene. The initial report listed her cause of death as a heart attack. Given her age and the absence of visible injuries, it seemed like a tragic but unremarkable passing. The community reacted with quiet shock. Margaret was known around Ashfield as gentle, polite, and deeply involved in the local church and community events. Neighbors described her as someone who always remembered birthdays, brought casseroles to the sick, and tended to her garden with care. Her death was mourned by many, and condolences poured in. But even as funeral preparations began, a few people close to her began to voice their unease. Her sister Ellen, who had spoken with Margaret just days before, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Margaret had mentioned feeling watched and hinted at troubles at home, though she never gave details. It was unusual for Margaret to be vague. She was known for being direct and practical. Even more troubling was that she had insisted they meet the following week to talk, saying she had something important to share. That meeting never happened. Meanwhile, Roger seemed oddly composed. He informed people of Margaret's passing with a tone that felt detached. He canceled the original burial plans and opted for a cremation within days. No autopsy was scheduled initially. Margaret had no known heart condition, no family history of cardiac issues, and had just completed a checkup a month prior with clean results. But, with cremation planned so quickly, her body and the potential truth would soon be gone forever. Ellen pushed back, asking for a delay. She reached out to the coroner's office and requested a private autopsy. At first she met resistance, but she was persistent, insisting that Margaret wouldn't have died suddenly without reason. Eventually, permission was granted just before the cremation was scheduled. That decision would turn out to be crucial. Margaret Turner's death wasn't what it seemed, and what began as a quiet farewell to a beloved woman was about to unravel into one of Ashfield's darkest and most shocking investigations. As investigators began to look more closely at Margaret Turner's sudden death, one detail stood out almost immediately: a life insurance policy worth $1,700,000, 0 cents, taken out just 3 months before she died. The policy named her husband, Roger Turner, as the sole beneficiary. It was an unusually large amount, especially for a retired couple with no dependents. Even more concerning, the policy was fast-tracked with no medical exam required, a loophole sometimes used in cases of fraud. Roger had been the one to push for the policy, claiming he wanted to ensure security for both of them in case something happened. But when the dust settled after Margaret's death, it was Roger alone who stood to benefit. That raised red flags for detectives who were now starting to view the death through a new lens, one not of misfortune, but of As they began to examine Roger's financial background, the picture grew darker. Over the previous 2 years, Roger had made several risky investments, primarily in a failed tech startup run by a distant relative. He had borrowed against their retirement savings, sold off a second property, and even drained a joint savings account without Margaret's knowledge. The couple had gone from financially comfortable to quietly desperate, and Margaret's friends had started to notice subtle changes. She spoke less about future plans. She canceled a planned vacation to visit her grandchildren in Florida, something she'd been looking forward to for months. She became quieter, more distracted, and hinted that she and Roger were not on the same page anymore. None of them could have imagined that financial stress could lead to murder, but the money and the secrecy surrounding it now looked suspicious. Roger's behavior in the aftermath of Margaret's death also raised concerns. He moved quickly to claim the insurance money, contacting the company the day after the autopsy report was released. He appeared agitated when he learned there would be a delay due to pending toxicology results. He also began making inquiries about selling the house, which was fully paid off and worth over $500,000. Friends described him as businesslike and in a hurry to move on. The combination of a sudden, unexpected death, a massive insurance policy, and a financially strapped husband painted a troubling picture. Detectives now believed that Margaret's death was not a medical tragedy but a calculated move driven by greed. But while suspicion was growing, they had no solid proof. Yet. It would take one final clue hidden deep in Margaret's private world to turn suspicion into certainty. Margaret Turner's body had been scheduled for cremation just days after her death, but her sister Ellen's insistence on a private autopsy changed everything. The procedure, performed quietly and without Roger's approval, would later prove to be the most critical decision in uncovering the truth. On the surface, Margaret appeared to have died of natural causes. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, and no external injuries. But as the medical examiner dug deeper, something disturbing came to light. Now it was clear that someone had been slowly poisoning her, and the prime suspect was her husband, Roger. Investigators began quietly gathering more information. They subpoenaed pharmacy records and discovered that Roger had purchased a series of supplements and over-the-counter herbal remedies in the weeks leading up to her death. One of those products contained concentrated foxglove extract, purchased online under an alias. The shipping address? Their home in Ashfield, Maine. While detectives learned from neighbors that Roger had recently cleaned out his garage, disposing of several containers and vials without explanation, when questioned, he claimed he was just getting rid of old junk. But his story didn't sit right with investigators. They retrieved surveillance footage from a local hardware store that showed Roger buying gloves, a mask, and cleaning solvents just 10 days before Margaret died. The evidence was stacking up, but it still wasn't enough to arrest him. Poison cases are notoriously difficult to prove without a smoking gun, something that links the poison directly to the accused with clear intent. Detectives were certain Roger had killed his wife for the insurance money, but they needed more. What they didn't know yet was that Margaret had already suspected her husband. She'd left behind something that would take the case in an entirely new direction, something that would turn this investigation into a full-blown unraveling of a carefully crafted life built on lies. 2 weeks after Margaret Turner's death, her sister Ellen received a letter in the mail. The envelope had no return address, but was unmistakably written in Margaret's neat, slanted handwriting. The postmark was dated the day before she died. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small silver key taped to the corner. The note was brief and unsettling. "If anything happens to me, go to the Jefferson Bank in Millbridge, Box 311. Trust no one." Ellen immediately brought the letter to investigators. At first they were skeptical. People make strange preparations as they age. But the timing, combined with the toxicology report and rising suspicions about Roger, made them take it seriously. She described how she had discovered the life insurance policy he took out without her knowledge, and how he grew increasingly angry when she confronted him about their finances and his affair. She wrote, "I may not live long enough to prove it, but someone needs to know what he's capable of." Margaret had feared for her life, and in her final days she ensured that her voice would not be silenced. The files Margaret left behind painted a devastating picture of betrayal, but they also offered investigators a roadmap. One of the most revealing discoveries was the evidence of Roger Turner's affair with Diane Matness. Margaret had included printouts of emails between them, carefully catalogued in a folder on the flash drive. The tone of the messages was intimate, laced with promises, plans, and disturbing hints at a future without Margaret. They spoke of starting over, of being free, and of not having to hide anymore. Investigators subpoenaed Roger's phone records and found dozens of late-night calls and texts to Diane, many during times he claimed to be asleep or out running errands. GPS data from his phone contradicted his alibi. On the night before Margaret's death, he claimed he had driven to visit a friend recovering from surgery, but cell phone towers placed him near a strip mall in another county. Surveillance footage from a 24-hour pharmacy in that mall showed Roger at 1:42 a.m. purchasing a blend of over-the-counter medications and herbal supplements, some of which were known to interact fatally with digoxin, the poison found in Margaret's system. Detectives also reviewed Diane's bank statements and learned that Roger had been sending her money in small, regular transfers, just under the reporting threshold. These payments started around the same time he took out the life insurance policy on Margaret. It seemed clear that Roger was financing a second life while quietly erasing the one he had. Further review of Roger's online activity revealed searches that could not be dismissed as coincidence. He had looked up phrases like how to fake a heart attack, undetectable poisons, and how much digoxin is lethal. He'd deleted his search history, but forensic analysts were able to recover fragments from his browsing logs. Investigators now had motive, opportunity, and a clear trail of premeditation. One of the most chilling moments came when detectives read a particular message from Roger to Diane, written just 2 weeks before Margaret's death. It said, "The timing has to be right. She's been feeling weak already. Once it happens, I'll handle everything quickly. We'll finally be done with this." While Roger continued to act as though he were the grieving widower, the walls were closing in. What he didn't know was that Margaret's quiet efforts before her death had built a case that was becoming bulletproof. The truth was unraveling fast, and soon there would be nowhere left for him to hide. As investigators dug deeper into Roger Turner's life, the story took a darker and more unexpected turn. While the evidence of Margaret's murder was growing stronger, another chilling revelation was about to surface, one buried decades in the past. Inside the safety deposit box Margaret had left behind was a separate folder labeled Roger's Past. It contained old newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a printed report from a private investigator Margaret had hired 6 months before her death. Among the documents was a name that investigators hadn't expected: Linda Turner. Roger's first wife Linda had vanished in 1982 during a weekend camping trip in rural Michigan. At the time, she and Roger had been married for just 5 years. The story, long forgotten by most, was unsettling. Roger claimed they had argued, and Linda went off for a walk in the woods to clear her head. She never returned. A large search was conducted, but no trace of her was ever found. No body, no clothing, no personal items. Eventually, the case went cold. Roger was questioned but never charged. There was no physical evidence tying him to Linda's disappearance, and no witnesses to contradict his story. He eventually left Michigan and started a new life in Illinois, where he met Margaret. Until now, no one had connected the two cases, but Margaret had. Somehow, she had discovered her husband's past and had begun to suspect that Linda's disappearance wasn't an accident. The private investigator's report detailed inconsistencies in Roger's original statement about the camping trip, along with testimonies from 2 former friends who had grown suspicious of him at the time. One recalled that Roger had made strange comments about how easy it would be for someone to disappear in the woods. Another mentioned that Roger seemed unusually calm after Linda vanished, more concerned about insurance paperwork than the search effort. Margaret had written in her notes that she feared history was repeating itself. She believed Roger had gotten away with murder once and was trying to do it again. this time with more planning and fewer mistakes. She feared that she, like Linda, would vanish under suspicious circumstances. But unlike Linda, Margaret refused to leave without leaving behind the truth. Detectives forwarded the information to Michigan authorities, reopening the decades-old cold case. What had begun as a suspicious death was now potentially linked to a long-forgotten disappearance. The story wasn't just about greed anymore. It was about a man with a history of manipulation, deceit, and possibly serial violence. Margaret's death had unearthed more than a crime. It had exposed a lifetime of secrets. As the investigation pressed forward, a clearer picture of Roger Turner's financial state emerged, one that showed just how far into desperation he had fallen. Once considered a financially stable retiree, Roger was in reality drowning in debt. Over the past 3 years, he had quietly burned through the couple's savings, betting on one risky investment after another. He had taken out personal loans, maxed out multiple credit cards, and defaulted on a small business venture that collapsed during the pandemic. Margaret, always careful with money, had reportedly been unaware of just how deep the financial hole had become. Bank statements revealed repeated transfers to online trading platforms, short-term lenders, and private accounts that Margaret's name was never attached to. She may have started to notice things weren't adding up. Missing funds, canceled travel plans, increased tension at home. The couple had even sold a rental property, supposedly to downsize, but in truth, the money had gone straight into paying off Roger's creditors. Then came the life insurance policy. Investigators learned that Roger had shopped around aggressively to multiple providers before securing a $1,700,000 0-cents policy through a company that didn't require a full medical evaluation. The policy was signed by both Roger and Margaret, but according to handwriting experts, Margaret's signature may have been forged, an issue now under further scrutiny. Either way, the policy had gone into effect just 84 days before her death, with Roger as the sole beneficiary. The pressure of impending financial collapse appeared to be the final spark. The timeline, matched against Roger's bank activity, showed that credit card companies had begun threatening legal action when she was threatening legal action. His house, though paid off, was next on the chopping block. He had quietly applied for a reverse mortgage just a week before Margaret's death. The insurance money wasn't just a potential windfall, it was his last hope of avoiding public and financial ruin. Investigators also discovered Roger had begun drafting plans to move out of state. He had emailed a real estate agent about listing the house and had inquired about properties in Oregon, where Diane Mathis had recently relocated. Text messages between the two revealed an urgency to get away and start fresh. The tone was confident, as if Roger believed everything was falling into place. But what he failed to anticipate was Margaret's foresight. While he meticulously planned the crime, Margaret had been quietly building a safety net of evidence. Peace. Roger believed he had control over everything, her money, her time, even the narrative of her death. What he didn't know was that Margaret had been watching, documenting, and preparing, and she had made sure the truth would catch up to him, no matter what. As Roger Turner moved forward with plans to claim the $1,700,000 0-cents life insurance payout, investigators were assembling the final pieces of a case that had transformed from a quiet death into a full-blown criminal investigation. The documents Margaret left behind had provided critical leads, but it was her handwritten letter to police, found in the safety deposit box, that sealed everything together with haunting precision. In the letter, Margaret detailed her growing fear that Roger was trying to kill her. She wrote with clarity, not panic, as if every word had been carefully considered. She explained how he had begun preparing her drinks, insisting she take vitamins and supplements that she never recognized. She noted changes in her body, unusual fatigue, dizziness, stomach pains, all symptoms she later connected to poisoning after doing her own research. Margaret also wrote about Roger's affair, stating that she had confronted him weeks earlier and that his response had been chilling, not with words but with silence and distance. He had stopped speaking to her unless necessary, had started locking doors, and even changed the passcode on his personal computer. She knew something was wrong but couldn't yet prove it, so she began collecting evidence herself, quietly and carefully. She suspected the life insurance policy was the motive. In the letter, she admitted to signing papers without reading them, trusting Roger at the time. She later discovered the policy after finding a printed confirmation in his office drawer. From that point on, she knew her time was likely running out. Margaret's decision to rent a safety deposit box in a different town under a false mailing address was a masterstroke of caution. She wrote that she didn't trust anyone, not even her friends or neighbors, because she believed Roger might be watching her every move. She made copies of emails, saved financial statements, took photographs, and even included a timeline of his movements in the final month of her life. The letter ended with a chilling statement. "If you are reading this, it means I'm gone. I was scared, but I refuse to die without a voice. Please, don't let him get away with this." It was this letter, more than any lab report or phone record, that gave prosecutors a human foundation for their case. Margaret had transformed from victim to whistleblower, from wife to silent investigator. In her final act, she handed the truth directly to those who could act on it. Her fear didn't paralyze her. It became her strength. And now, justice had a name, a motive, and a story that could no longer be buried. With the mounting evidence gathered from the safety deposit box and the detailed letter Margaret had left behind, prosecutors felt confident enough to move forward with charges against Roger Turner. The case that had started as a tragic death was now a high-profile murder investigation involving poison, betrayal, and decades-old secrets. At the arraignment, Roger maintained a calm exterior, but beneath it there was tension. His lawyer attempted to cast doubt on the toxicology report, questioning the reliability of the digoxin findings and suggesting that Margaret's health issues could have led to her sudden death naturally. They also argued that the life insurance policy was legitimate and that Roger's financial difficulties were exaggerated. However, the prosecution had a mountain of evidence that spoke louder than any defense claims. The timeline of Roger's purchases of herbal supplements containing foxglove extract, the surveillance footage placing him near pharmacies at odd hours, and the GPS data contradicting his alibis painted a picture of calculated premeditation. The affair with Diane Matmus and the financial transactions funneling money to her added a layer of motive fueled by greed and deception. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Margaret's letter. Her calm, detailed account of the poisoning and her fears about Roger's intentions were presented as a statement from beyond the grave. The jury would later say that reading the letter was like hearing Margaret's voice, clear and determined, calling for justice. The cold case from Michigan, involving Roger's first wife Linda Turner, was reopened. But it was Margaret's murder that became the focus. Investigators hoped that the renewed scrutiny might uncover more about Roger's past, possibly revealing a pattern of violence and manipulation. His history of evading responsibility for Linda's disappearance cast a long shadow over the trial throughout the pre-trial period. Roger's image crumbled. Friends and neighbors who once saw him as a devoted husband now viewed him as a calculated killer. The media dubbed the case the poisoned marriage. Followed in a grotesque murder at the hands of the other year people couldn't forget. Highlighting the chilling nature of the crime and the dramatic twist of Margaret outsmarting her own husband after death, As the trial date approached, the community braced for a courtroom drama that would expose the darkest corners of a seemingly ordinary marriage. The story was no longer just about a sudden death. The courtroom was packed the day the trial of Roger Turner began. Reporters from across the state had descended on Ashfield, drawn by the sensational story of a man accused of killing his wife for money, and a wife who had left behind a meticulously crafted trail of evidence that exposed him. The trial promised to be one of the most compelling true crime cases the small town had ever seen. Read 'em the start, the prosecution laid out a clear and haunting narrative. They described Margaret Turner's final days in painful detail, relying heavily on the letter she had written. The judge allowed the letter to be read aloud, and as the words filled the courtroom, it was as if Margaret herself was there, telling the jury her story. Her calm, precise descriptions of Roger's poisoning, the hidden life insurance policy, and his affair painted a picture of betrayal so deep it stunned everyone present. The prosecution's expert witnesses included toxicologists who explained how digoxin works and why Margaret's symptoms matched deliberate poisoning. Financial experts traced Roger's growing debts and suspicious transactions, while digital forensic specialists detailed the recovered internet searches and deleted emails that revealed Roger's premeditated plans. Surveillance footage and phone records placed him near locations connected to the crime at critical times. Roger's defense tried to dismantle the case piece by piece. They suggested alternative explanations for the poisoning, questioned the authenticity of some documents, and argued that Roger was being framed by someone with a grudge. But their arguments often fell flat under cross-examination, especially when confronted with the overwhelming evidence from Margaret's safety deposit box. The turning point came when the jury heard about Linda Turner, Roger's missing first wife. The prosecution presented the reopened cold case, suggesting a chilling pattern of behavior. The notion that Roger had potentially gotten away with murder once before added a layer of menace to the proceedings. It was a stark reminder that Margaret's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a broader story of deception and danger. After weeks of testimony and deliberations, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Roger Turner's mask of composure finally broke as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case closed with a somber recognition of Margaret's bravery. In death, she had done what few victims managed. She outsmarted her killer and brought him to justice. Her story became a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, the truth can prevail. And in a small town shaken to its core, peace was slowly restored, knowing that justice had been served.